Thanks for that introduction, Michael. I'm always find it funny when people talk about the experience that I've had. I still feel young, and it's always interesting to hear that. Probably a good reminder at times. Can I just add to Lee's acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, and also pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And thanks everyone for coming today. It's great to see so many people here in the CEDA Sydney office, and thank you for making your way through construction zone downstairs, which I wasn't totally aware of until I got here this morning either. So not always easy to get through those things. So if you look at CEDA's research over recent years, a common thread that we've had really for many years has been about supporting the creation of new economic opportunities. But equally, we've been concerned with how we can ensure that those economic opportunities are spread as broadly as possible so that we can lift our economic potential, we can reinforce social cohesion and underpin well-being. And we know from our research that this is an area that the community really cares about. Our Community Pulse survey last year found that 80% of people were concerned about the gap between the richest and poorest in our society here in Australia. So disrupting disadvantage, setting the scene, is really the first in a series of reports to look at how we better connect disadvantaged people to economic opportunity and well-being. And the stubbornness and complexity of this problem really lends itself to a longer term process, which is not always the process that we take with our reports. But we need ideas, we need analysis, we need feedback, debate, and an ongoing process to do this. Just thinking about some of the philosophical underpinnings on this, if I think about John Rawls' theory of justice, in that he argues that a just society is one in which you choose to live if you knew everything about the distribution of outcomes in that society, but nothing about where you would fall in terms of that distribution of outcomes. And at first blush, I like to think that Australia is a place that I would choose to live based on that test, and certainly much better than other advanced economies. We have, after all, our much lauded egalitarian nature. We have a social safety net. We have seen, until the middle of this decade, broad-based increases in income. But the more I think about this question, numbers start to pop into my head. Like, as Michael mentioned, the 1 in 6 children living in income poverty. Or, as Michael also mentioned, the 700,000 Australians who've been in persistent income poverty for at least 4 years. Or the 1 million people facing deep social exclusion in Australia. Or the fact that on 3 of 7 measures, we're not failing to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. And then my mind turns to those people who are interacting with our safety net, like the 460,000 people who've been on Newstart for more than a year, a payment at $280 a week that's well below the poverty line. And then there are the 140,000 people who are on public housing waiting lists at last count. Now, these headline numbers are not the ones that economists like me usually focus on, but we should be paying a lot more attention to them. And we should never forget, as Michael has said, that behind these numbers are real lives and people who are trying to access a reasonable standard of living and a sense of well-being. So CEDA's research is focused on those people who are at risk or who have become stuck in disadvantage, and the policies, programs and systems that have become stuck. So the reasons why Australia has become stuck on this issue, I think, will no doubt be all too familiar to many people here today. Disadvantage is complex and multifaceted. Income poverty, material deprivation, social exclusion. It encompasses issues around unemployment, chronic disease, disability, mental health, trauma, addiction, among many other factors. In addressing the immediate hardships and crises that arise from disadvantage, it's difficult to see the whole person and address all of their difficulties within the architecture of services and resources available. And often people are navigating difficult life transitions or transitions between institutional settings as they face these crises. The public debate is often sympathetic, but it overestimates the individual capacity to exit disadvantage without empathy and assistance. Some of the policies that are essential to our safety net have failed to keep pace with economic circumstances and community expectations. The weight of evidence shows that the current rate of New Start is increasing rather than mitigating the risk of recipients becoming stuck in disadvantage. Added to this are further interventions such as work for the dole and proposed interventions such as drug testing, where the evidence base is actually quite weak. Public housing has failed to keep pace with population growth, forcing more and more vulnerable Australians into the private rental market. And at the same time, Commonwealth rent assistance hasn't kept pace with rents over the past 2 decades in that rental market. And this is a critical failure in affordable housing for low-income households that CEDA has long been concerned about, at least since as far back as 2000. A potted history of recent decades suggests that budgetary and political cycles have seen a revolving door of new initiatives and reviews. Social inclusion boards, neighbourhood renewal programs, major reviews of our tax and transfer systems. While evaluation is often a prerequisite for continued funding of a program, it is rare for governments to require evaluation to confirm the failure of a program before discontinuing its funding. We should not be surprised that innovation in these areas can be messy. It will take time, and there will certainly be risks. But as recent reports from the Commonwealth Auditor General confirm, we often fail to put in place the right data, evaluation and governance frameworks at the start to manage these risks. But despite all of this and all the challenges that we face, I think there are some new and emerging examples of approaches to disadvantage that are making inroads. And they're often based on the incredible energy of local communities, committed individuals and organisations. From Logan Together in Queensland, where I was yesterday in Brisbane, to the Smith Family's Learning for Life program, which I'm sure Anne will talk to us more about today, Doveton College's Our Place in Victoria, or the 100 Families project in WA. The people I've met involved with these projects are very humble about what they've achieved to date and about the challenges that they face into the future. But you'd have to say that they're disrupting the status quo, and there's some common themes, I think, that emerge from some of their experience. Their focus is squarely on building and enabling capacity and capability rather than assuming that it exists. They establish a focal point for bringing services and support to people, whether this is location, life transition, or assessed vulnerability. And they manage to take a more holistic approach to addressing complex needs, including breaking down silos in otherwise fragmented services. But the question, of course, is how do we take some of the learnings from these examples and others and the consensus on what hasn't worked to drive more systemic change. An essential ingredient, we think, must be better integrated government data sets and analytics. But of course, recent experience with data in the welfare space, you have to say, has not gone smoothly. Robo-debt has eroded trust and heightened perceptions that digital technologies are more about ensuring compliance than better lives. Yet the problems that lie at the heart of this issue appear to be human-induced. For example, an unreliable income averaging calculation, amongst others. And technology has increased the reach and velocity of those problems. So we propose that integrated data sets at the government level are used with the intention of making people's lives better and providing the necessary support. And I think for a lot of years, certainly in the conversations that I've been in about data sets in this area and many others, this has all seemed pretty utopian. Potentially game-changing, but pretty elusive across bureaucracies and let alone levels of government in Australia. And I think that, to me, has changed a little bit since the New South Wales government's Their Futures Matter initiative, and the fact that they have managed to link their longitudinal administrative data sets over the space of about 3 years. And their data set from 1990 onwards identifies vulnerable groups of young people based on a number of domains, including health, home and education. And they're focused on two populations, vulnerable children aged 0 to 5, and also children and young people experiencing mental illness. It's early days, but it looks like it's beginning to inform service delivery approaches, including New South Wales Health's first 2,000 days framework. I'm sure we'll hear more from Alan in the panel session around some of these issues. So you start to ask yourself the question, if governments have the requisite information when it's connected that can illuminate the pathways of lives and the pathways that people's lives take and how we can make those lives better, then surely it's worth exploring how this could be used responsibly, how this information could be used responsibly. Could it be used to target the right interventions early on and support for those most at risk of disadvantage, right from childhood? Would this further bolster local knowledge in communities and frontline services on these matters? But I think it's more than just this. Could it be used to ensure transparency of allocations of investment, funding adequacy, and ensuring that governments are accountable for progress in assisting disadvantaged populations? And could it be used to better inform business cases for leveraging intergovernmental funding injections, where the long-term fiscal gain to the Commonwealth justifies a federal investment in better support? These questions are worth serious consideration, I think, but so are the safeguards and infrastructure that would be necessary to ensure that data is used responsibly. Before we get to big data even, we need to deal with all the little data that sits within agencies and different silos of the system. So we don't underestimate for a minute the challenges and work that has to be done in this area. It also requires collective intelligence. This isn't about ignoring the knowledge of caseworkers and humans, it's about complementing it. There's also inherent biases in many data sets, including areas like justice, where we're likely to encounter these sources of bias. So we really need to be careful about the metrics and data sets that we're looking at for these purposes. Much like has been suggested for private companies using data and algorithms, there's a place for independent certification and assessment around the ethics of how this is being conducted. Individuals and communities also need to have trust in the collection of data, and this may mean that there's a case for local institutions being involved in stewardship and custodianship of that data. Privacy, another big issue, has to be managed, and some of the issues, like de-identification, they're not fail-safe. So there's a lot to manage there, and it demands a lot from government. They've got to communicate so that the public understand not just the risks but also the benefits, and the community should feel like they have the requisite understanding of how their data is being used. Data, of course, should be complemented by better navigation, particularly for those who find themselves managing a complex web of services. We're already seeing various forms of navigation in practice, including around dedicated case management. Examples here in New South Wales, the new PIN social benefit bond that has case managers working with new parents and infants, and also Target 120 in WA, which is working with young offenders. We think that navigated case management could be systematically piloted in Australia's most disadvantaged postcodes, or for people undergoing critical life transitions, for example, when people are coming out of prison. But we also need to invest in a stronger safety net. And here I think, nerdy economic point, but perhaps a different take on this. It's worth drawing on one of this year's Nobel Economic Prize winners, Professor Michael Creamer. Professor Creamer's O-ring theory of development suggests that in economies, the weakest link matters. Just like a leaking O-ring seal in your car really matters, as I've learned recently. So in other words, it isn't enough to have sophisticated government data sets or superior services if people don't have access to adequate income support and housing. And to me, New Start, Commonwealth Rent Assistance and public housing are the O-rings in our safety net. And as the weakest link at present, they do matter. And of course, our policies and programs must be supported by better evaluation. And we've been banging on about this at CEDA, I think, across a number of areas in recent years. It should insulate effective programs from becoming the victims of budget and political cycles, but also bring about necessary change in some existing programs. We noted in our Sustainable Budgets report at the start of the year that discipline on evaluation has slipped right across governments and across particular portfolios. But in the area of disadvantage, there's a real heightened cost from that chopping and changing of programs that happens without consistent evaluation. And finally, we think that addressing disadvantage requires a champion or champions across government. Previously, we've had bodies that have done this. I mentioned the Social Inclusion Board before, that really brought a national focus to these challenges. And perhaps it's unrealistic to expect that any one body in the current kind of suite of machinery of government could look at these issues. But perhaps there's a number of people who could come together. It could be a collective of existing organisations like the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, like the National Data Commissioner on the data issues that I've mentioned. So these are just a few areas and ideas for feedback, challenge, discussion, debate. And to that end, we have actually, we don't usually do this, but we have put a feedback page and a link that people can go into off the report page on the website. So there's that capability to give us feedback. Of course, I'm very happy for people to come and meet with us and share their ideas as well. I promise that we won't turn down a meeting from anyone who wants to engage on this issue. So I think that our proposals will evolve and will generate further proposals over the next few years. And that's a good thing, because I think CEDA's strength, as Lee mentioned, is in our cross-sectoral membership and the capacity to bring different people together for ideas, debate and discussion. So it's in this spirit that we've released this report to start that discussion. In coming decades, it's my hope that we can connect more Australians to some of the incredible progress that we've had in the past and disrupt disadvantage. Thanks for your attention.